Hello everyone. Just wanted to go through the mixing plaster part of the plaster carving project. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to teach you guys how to mix your plaster so that you can make a blank that you will be carving from. So here's the example that I had in the classroom that somebody had carved from plaster, and then you can see it's kind of covered. It's been sealed with like a shellac to make it a little bit more water resistant, because plaster on its own is not, and it will absorb water and kind of fall apart if you like leave it outside or anything. So if you choose to put shellac on it to kind of protect it, you can do that. So again, we're gonna mix our plaster to make our plaster blank to carve from. Okay, so this is what it's gonna end up kind of looking like once the plaster has been mixed and set. You can use anything that's plastic or has a wax layer on it to keep it waterproof. So I kept some, like this was a soup container, this was an old yogurt container. You can also use an orange juice carton. It has a wax layer on the inside, so it protects it from leakage. So I would just cut off the top of the orange juice container and then pour the liquid plaster in there once I got it mixed up. Or you can use just a milk carton. Again, just cut off the top so it's easier for you to pour the plaster into. And this would give you a much bigger piece to work from if you want to work a little larger. So in your supply kit, you should have gotten a bag of plaster. So make sure you have a container that you're going to put your plaster into to set. Make sure you have your plaster itself, something to scoop the plaster out with, and I'm using a bigger bucket to mix my plaster in. It's just much easier than trying to mix it in the container that you are gonna use for your blank, just because if I pour water in here and start putting plaster in, I'm trying to mix it with my hand is going to displace all of that plaster and it's going to overflow and make a big mess. And we would like to avoid that as much as possible. So big bucket, plaster, something to scoop your plaster with, probably some paper towel would be good, and you're going to need some water. So I'm starting out with this just for demonstration purposes. I got the water before I started the video. I'm using warm water because I think it blends easier. You can get rid of the clumps of the plaster quicker, and it's just nicer to put your hand into than cold water. So these containers are about the same size. So I filled it up to over half, about 2/3 of the container. That's going to make more plaster than I'm going to need, but at the same time, it's kind of nice to have that extra just as a buffer. And if you have 2 containers, you might as well fill up a little extra in an extra container. So you have 2 blanks to work from if, the first one, something goes wrong or you don't like it or, whatever, then you have the option of just starting with the second blank. So hopefully you guys can see, here's my bucket. I'm just going to pour that water into my bucket. And at this point, I am going to take my powdered plaster and start scooping it in. So what I want to do is kind of slowly fill it. I don't want to just dump a bunch of plaster in there. What I'm watching for is I want to fill it slowly so that it absorbs the water as I'm filling it, and kind of put the plaster throughout the bottom of the whole container so it's kind of evenly distributed. And that was a little bit more of a dump than I meant for. So you can see the air bubbles are popping up. That's the plaster kind of absorbing the water. I'm going to keep adding. Now I could have sifted this plaster to get some of the big clumps out. I think there was something in there, but that's okay. Make it a little easier for mixing it by hand, but it'll be okay. So I'm going to keep adding this plaster until it starts to, the peak of the plaster is going to come above the water. It's going to start peaking above the water. Kind of break the surface. And then I'll start mixing it by hand. So I'm trying to keep it kind of pouring. I'm trying to pour throughout the whole container so it's not just hitting one spot. All right, so it's starting to peak there. You can see it's not really absorbing as much. It's hitting the surface of the water. All right, so I think at this point, you guys can see, it's still absorbing, but it's come to the surface of the water, and it's not soaking it up really quick. So at this point, I think I have enough plaster in there to start mixing it with my hand. So I'm just gonna stick my hand in there, and I want to kind of slowly mix it. I don't want to just go in there and like whip it, because you want to keep as much of the air bubbles out as possible. Otherwise, when it sets, what's going to happen is you have a bunch of bubbles in your solid blank, right? And when you're carving, you're going to run into all these like weird blank spots within your sculpture that you may not want in there. You're looking for a solid piece that you can carve into. So I'm just kind of slowly making sure I get all those clumps kind of broken up, making sure all of the plaster is blended with the water. And this plaster is kind of gritty. So it's not as smooth as like a plaster of Paris, but it'll still do the job. I just got this from the hardware store. I can just kind of feel a couple more clumps in there. I'm trying to break up. And you can see it's still liquidy, but it's thicker, right? It's like whole milk, or like, I don't know if that's like I don't know what you call that. Okay. And I always take a piece of paper towel to wipe my hand off. I don't go directly to the sink. You don't want to pour a bunch of plaster down your sink. It can cause some blockage in the pipes, so make sure you get as much of the plaster off your hands, and once the bucket's empty, like wipe it out with paper towel and throw it in the garbage instead of, or you can even let it go solid and then just dump it out in the garbage can once it's solid. To make sure you're not pouring a bunch of liquid plaster down your sink, okay? All right, so I am now going to take my container that I wanted to make my blank from, and I am going to slowly pour it in there. Look at that, I actually made there's just a little left over. That was just about perfect. All right, so at this point, I'm just gonna kind of tap it. You can see on the surface, there's some air bubbles kind of forming. This is called agitating. I'm agitating the plaster, trying to get those air bubbles, any air bubbles that are in here from the pouring, I want those all to come up to the surface and kind of pop. That way I'm not going to have those blank bubbles within the sculpture when I'm trying to carve it. So you can see all those air bubbles that have come to the surface. And you can even do this, kind of tap it on the side. Now it seems like they're just little bubbles popping up. Most of the big ones have already come to the surface. Just do this for a minute or two. All right. So now I'm just going to let that sit. I'll let it sit overnight. I'm not going to cover it or anything. I'm just going to let it sit out. And you'll be able to tell once you pick it up, it should be solid to the touch. If I sat here, I don't think it should take 24 hours, but I'm just going to let it sit because it's a pretty big solid piece. If you sat here and kind of like watched it and touched it occasionally, you would tell that when it's setting, it kind of warms up. The temperature of the plaster actually warms. And I can even kind of feel that on the container itself right now. That's the plaster, the process of it setting. So it should become solid relatively soon. But I'm just going to let this sit overnight. So if you get this done day one, hopefully the next day it should be ready for you to cut away. So I would have to cut this plastic container away from it, and then you'll have your blank to work from. Okay, so that's step one, mixing your plaster and making your blank for the carving. Okay, thanks guys.